All right, perfect. So hello, thank you for coming to our first webinar of the semester. For folks joining us for the first time, Student Energy Club is a student-led organization focused on providing a platform for energy experts of today to educate the NC State community on critical challenges that the energy system is facing, as well as emerging technologies being used to mitigate them. We also offer a mentoring program at NC State for students wanting to get involved in cutting edge energy research that occurs across a variety of disciplines on our campus, both engineering and non-engineering. If you're interested in learning more about the mentorship program or our organization in general, you can visit us at ncsuenergyclub.org. Now, we're really excited to welcome our speaker for today, Dr. Arvind Ravikumar, who's an assistant professor of energy engineering at Harrisburg University of Science and Technology. Dr. Ravikumar conducts research in technology, systems, and policy as it relates to energy and the environment. We're pleased to welcome him to give a talk on this very relevant topic, especially timely in light of the several executive actions we've seen from the current administration on climate. We will have time for a Q&A at the end, so I highly encourage all of you, especially the students, to ask any questions that you have. The Q&A will be moderated by Dr. Andrew Grishop, who's an associate professor in the Civil, Construction, and Environmental Engineering Department. Dr. Grishop, before we get started, are there any Q&A housekeeping logistics that you want to share with the audience?
Hi, everyone, and thank you for attending, and thank you especially to Dr. Ravikumar for joining us. So I think there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window, and please use that throughout the talk to ask questions, and I'll try to sort of organize them and moderate a bit as we get to the end. We won't be interrupting for questions during the talk, just because it's a little bit hard to manage that and the other windows, especially for the speaker. So, but we will be monitoring the Q&A and also the chat in case questions end up there. So thank you again for attending, and we'll turn it over to Dr. Ravikumar for the seminar.
All right, excellent. I'm going to share my screen. All right, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. I can't see faces, so you'll have to say it loudly. All right, excellent. Thank you so much, Martina, for that really kind introduction, and for the Student Energy Club for inviting me to present at the seminar. There's been a lot of changes over the past month in the space of oil and gas industry, and I'm going to be talking about some of those issues and what that means for the future of the use of fossil fuels in this country, but also around the world. Before I start, I want to thank all my students who have been working on this topic for the past 2 years. I'm just the face of all the results that I'm presenting, but they're the ones who have been doing all the hard work on this topic. And this is an acknowledgement to the work that they've been doing in the lab. All right, with that, let's get started. So I'm going to be talking about the role of natural gas in the Biden-Harris administration's climate agenda. But more broadly, what I want to do today is give a sense of what are the trends in natural gas, especially, that are driving changes in the policy world, in the technology world, and in the business world. I'll move on to give 2 examples of how this is happening, one from the domestic policy side and one from the international and global policy side. And I will conclude with sort of, something to think about, like food for thought, about 4 research questions that I've been thinking about, and I think where there's going to be a lot of work happening in the next decade or 2. All right, so this talk is sort of divided into 4 parts. The first part is sort of the context in terms of, where we are and how we got where we are right now in the natural gas world. I'm going to be talking about national and global developments in gas supply and demand, and some of the policy currents to address climate change and its intersection with how we use natural gas. In the second and third part, I'm going to be giving specific examples from my own research on how things are moving in the natural gas world from a US policy perspective, as well as an international policy perspective. These are all very fast moving fields. So something that I might say today might not be true tomorrow, even as we'll see shortly how policies are moving in Congress right as we speak and discuss this topic here. And the last part of this talk will be about 4 to 5 minutes of what comes next. What are the research questions for the next decade, and what personally my own group is thinking about in this context. All right, so natural gas in a carbon constrained world. So the first thing I think everyone is talking about are the major policy currents that determine the future of natural gas in this world. From my perspective, there are 6 of them: are federal policy, investor activism, global climate action, new technologies, demand side changes, and global demand, especially from developing countries. And what I'm going to do in the next 5 minutes is give an idea of how these 6 different policy currents are affecting the oil and gas side of our fossil fuels. Right? Okay, the first thing is that as many of you might know, the Biden administration is walking the talk on its commitment to addressing the climate crisis. The executive orders on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad, it was an extensive order that took about an hour for me to just get through the language of it. But there are so many things related to oil and gas that came out of that. The first one was the Keystone XL pipeline that was canceled. And if you look at the reaction between the US versus Canada, what you would notice is that there's a lot of discussion and debate in Canada. But besides the usual actors, there was not much of a big deal made out of the Keystone XL cancellation. It was as if people were expecting it to happen anyway. There was a ban or suspension of leases for fossil fuel development on federal lands, which again generated a lot of discussion. In fact, right earlier today, there was a hearing in the House or in the Senate about this, and there was a lot of questions around what this means for US oil and gas production. Similarly, we have companies like General Motors coming out and saying that they're going to go all electric vehicle by 2035, and many others that jumped on Trump administration's lawsuits against California's auto rules have now rescinded their intent and now going back to agreeing with California on their fuel efficiency standards. So the point is, there's a lot of work being done both to address supply side issues as well as demand side issues from the Biden administration. And that's going to have a major impact in how companies and investors think about the future of oil and gas. The second one, investor pressure and activism from climate coalitions are forcing fossil fuel corporations to rethink strategy on climate inaction or climate action. Just yesterday, Exxon under pressure started talking about low carbon business units and investing in carbon capture programs. This is especially significant because Exxon has been one of the worst companies in terms of getting ahead of climate crisis and the climate action compared to other oil majors. For example, Shell, Repsol, they've all come out and say they're going to set net zero targets for carbon by 2050. We have no idea how they're going to do it or if they can do it, but at least they're saying the right things, looking at what's happening around the world. Shell late last year said they already saw peak oil, probably in 2019. And I think until very recently, the discussions around peak oil has been sort of relegated to environmentalists or like fringe actors, but a major oil company coming out and saying that we might have already seen peak oil is a huge deal within the oil and gas world. Simultaneously, we are seeing far more political action from oil and gas companies. Total and more recently Equinor, they said they're going to leave the largest oil and gas lobbying group in the United States, the API, American Petroleum Institute, because of fundamental differences in how to tackle the climate action. API was against methane regulations. Every single major oil and gas company are publicly stating that they want methane rules. And so a lot of action is moving towards supporting regulations to address emissions from the oil and gas sector. The third thing, and related to this, you can see this in sort of the share price of these stocks. The purple one at the top is Vestas Wind System, one of the largest wind energy suppliers in the country. in the world. The blue is the S&P 500 index, and the three colors, orange, light blue, and yellow, are all major oil and gas companies, ExxonMobil, BP, and Chevron. As you can see, over the past 5 years, their stock prices have been declining in relation to even the S&P index, and especially with clean energy companies. Methane emissions is a big deal. Every senator talks about methane emissions as something bipartisan, because it's one thing that the oil and gas companies, regulators, and environmentalists agree on, that methane emissions from oil and gas operations have to be tackled. And it is increasingly becoming a litmus test in global gas trade. Just last year, the French government blocked US LNG deal, basically by saying that US natural gas producers emit too much methane at the West Texas oil and gas fields. I think this is a big deal. This sort of lit a fire under US LNG exporters who really want to sell US natural gas to the EU. And so there's push even from the industry to get more stronger methane regulations. In parallel, EU has adopted methane strategy, which if the US does not heed, will sort of find itself in the wrong end of methane, of natural gas trade. Part of being a world leading producer of oil and gas is that you'll have to respond to global currents in climate action, and methane regulation is just one of them. The next thing is sort of things that I work a lot on, I think about a lot, are new technologies. New technologies such as satellites is going to make it easier and cheaper for environmental organizations, for regulators and scientists to monitor methane emissions. And this is really important because until recently, you need to get permission from an oil and gas operator to go to their site and measure emissions. And the only people who are going to invite you are probably people who already have a handle on their emissions. And those who don't are not going to let you come onto their site and measure emissions. But for satellites, for using satellites, the EPA or any state regulator, or even as individuals, we don't need anyone's permission to look at data. And so this is going to revolutionize how we think about methane emissions, how operators are penalized for not having a tight grip on their operations, and how international trade in oil and gas will be affected by advances in technology. Then we have demand side changes. This is something that's coming from bottom up, from states and cities and communities, and the availability of new technologies. Several major cities have banned or consider banning gas hookups in new buildings. There are a lot of equity implications on how this is going to be done, but that's a separate topic for research. We also have several states and some utilities committed to 100% clean energy standards. And what you see on the right is sort of a draft bill that's already moving through the 117th, the current Congress in the House and Senate, in a bipartisan way to develop strong methane regulations for US oil and gas operations. So it's a lot of activity, a lot of changes coming to the sector. The last thing is developing economies are also rethinking their expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure for many reasons: economics, climate, and also simple politics. China announced a net zero carbon neutrality pledge by about 2060, which essentially means that the proposed changes to Chinese energy sources compared to 2025 is going to be a reduction in natural gas use, which is going to affect a lot of exporters because China is one of the largest importers of US LNG. There's also discussions around why India's gas boom is running out of steam for a whole host of reasons. One of the primary reason being energy security. India does not have a lot of domestic gas resources, so everything has to be imported from outside. And if you look at IEA, the International Energy Agency, often one of the more conservative outlook in terms of transitions to non-fossil resources has come out and said that the sustainable development scenario between 2019 and 2030, as you can see here, you're not going to see a big growth in gas. So the purple block, that's the 2019 energy use, that's gas. And if you see the SDS, which is sustainable development scenario, and the net zero scenario, there's no growth in gas. And so what you're seeing is, from the policy side, things are happening that's addressing current emissions from oil and gas, that's addressing future demand from oil and gas, and you're seeing companies and countries and cities moving towards sort of net zero emissions and trying to think of local policies from the demand side that's going to reduce demand for oil and gas. And so this is sort of the world in which we are living in, and this is where oil and gas companies operate and thinking about, okay, what can we do to help with this transition, or at least do not seem like an outlier in terms of, to the point of blocking any meaningful climate action. All right. So this is sort of where we are right now. So what are we doing in this? What are the major research questions that we are working on? So first thing I'm going to talk about is US methane policy, and specifically how new technologies are changing the policy landscape. This is important because new technologies is something everyone is excited about. There's a lot of new things coming out, and there's a lot of work to do in terms of understanding how these technologies work and how they can be incorporated within the policy context. All right, so this graph is something that tells you about the landscape of new technologies. You're going to see temporal scale on the y-axis and spatial scale on the x-axis. It's basically saying, at the smallest level, let's say, for example, a valve broke, and at the largest level, which is continent and global scale monitoring of methane emissions. Similarly, on the temporal scale, you have measurements that are done in seconds and minutes, and you also have measurements that are done continuously for decades and years. And you have all these different technologies. One example is satellites that can continuously monitor methane emissions remotely over large spatial scales. These are great if you want to understand how methane emissions change in inventories, you want to understand trends over time. At the other end of the spectrum, you have something called as handheld monitors and stationary sensors, where you just put it on an oil and gas site. It continuously monitors methane emissions and tells you if something's wrong with the site so it can go fix it. So the biggest challenge right now in the policy world is that the current approaches to addressing methane leak detection are not well suited for understanding our methane emissions in oil and gas industry. So this is an example of what we do now. We just take a handheld camera, point it at different equipment, and see if methane is leaking. Admittedly, this works, as you can see in this video. You just have to go around every single facility, measure this, record this, and fix it if possible. The problem is, these are effective, but the problem is they are expensive and they're also slow. So if you want to address methane emissions, you want to get, say, 90% reduction in emissions, doing it once a year is not going to cut it. You might have to do it once a month, maybe even once a week. And that's going to become expensive and slow, considering we have hundreds and thousands of wells all across this country. And so one of the biggest questions right now in the policy and the technology world is, can we improve the cost effectiveness of methane mitigation? And relatedly, can we introduce new technologies to better detect emissions? And that's something what we're doing. The problem is when you start talking to regulators and even the operators about new technologies, like a satellite, the immediate feedback is that, regulator, the EPA is not letting us do it, so we're not going to take a risk to do it, and the EPA fining us for not using approved technologies. So we had to get people together to figure out, exactly what you would need to approve some of these new systems. And so what we called that was a framework for equivalence. EPA is a way of doing things. The question is, what do you need to prove? What do you need to show? So EPA will let you use some of the newer systems, like satellites, like planes, like drones. So we organized a workshop where we brought in regulators, industry folks, scientists from the US and Canada. We actually had 3 different workshops, 2 in the US and 1 in Canada, to discuss and hash out a framework for approving new technologies. And the key idea is we wanted to avoid fraud and abuse. We don't want everyone coming up with a new technology and saying ours is better, so let us do this. A lot of the lessons were learned from the carbon offset programs. And the next thing is we want to ensure mitigation targets are met irrespective of whatever technology you're using. So we came up with a framework that basically involved some testing technologies in the field, some modeling technologies in the field, and figuring out if new technologies can achieve the same emissions mitigation as some of the older technologies. So these pictures are from a fieldwork that was completed early 2020 before the pandemic shut everything down. This is where we took about 10 technologies out to oil and gas facilities, tested them, analyzed whether they work, and talked to policymakers. We in fact brought them to the site to show how these things work and help them understand how new technologies can play a bigger role in addressing methane emissions. This was not enough. This was, I think, one of the first large-scale tests of new technologies. We had about 3 drones, 4 different planes, 3 different teams on truck-based systems. But this is just starting. So many new technologies are there. We're going to do a lot more testing to understand how these new technologies can fit in a methane policy context. Simultaneously, we also started developing models. This model is called FEAST, thanks to one of my grad students who coined the phrase. FEAST really stands for Fugitive Emissions Abatement Simulation Tool. What this model does is basically simulate methane policies around the world. So it takes in data on emissions from oil and gas fields. It takes data on technologies and methods. So we did the field work, we take the data and put it into the model, and it takes in policy constraints in terms of what the EPA wants. And we can talk about technology equivalence. We can talk about costs and benefits of LDAP program options. We can talk about long-term emissions reductions. So what we're doing is we developed this model. It's been over 3 years now. We're continuously updating it as new technologies are developed and we learn more things about methane emissions. But right now what we're doing is we are using this model and trying to help states and regulators use this model. Right now in Colorado, California, and starting in Pennsylvania, folks are trying to use this model to approve new technologies. The goal is in the future, we can use models like this. There are some other models available as well to be able to go to a regime where we can start talking about who's a good operator, who's a bad operator with respect to emissions, and sort of have a quantitative understanding of who to penalize and who to reward for having low methane emissions. This is ongoing. We're talking with lots of stakeholders on this to expand this model and to use this model to develop effective methane mitigation policies. So this sort of gives you an idea of what's happening in the domestic world. Banning leasing on oil and gas is something that's happening, but that's not going to change emissions immediately just because companies already have a lot of drilling permits. They just haven't drilled yet. So that's not going to be an issue. But one thing that everyone's focused on is reducing methane emissions, both in the US and globally. And our group is trying to develop some of the tools that you would need to do that in a rigorous manner. I'm going to switch tracks for the next maybe 10 minutes to talk about international methane policy and the future of LNG. The reason I want to talk about this is because whenever you bring up climate action, whenever you bring up getting to net zero and fossil fuels, the refrain you hear is that natural gas is not bad because we can use natural gas to reduce global carbon emissions if you use it to replace coal emissions. And coal to gas switching, to be honest, has done a lot of good work in the United States. It has reduced emissions from the power sector significantly. And the hope is, at least among the people who are sort of evangelizing LNG, is that we can do the same thing around the world. We can take US natural gas to China, to India, to Southeast Asia, to Eastern Europe, and help them switch their coal plants to gas and thereby reduce global emissions. I think there's a reasonable argument there, at least in the near term. But I think one of the questions we wanted to think about and we wanted to ask is, does this make sense long term? And the reason is the oldest LNG plant in the world is about 50 years old. So if you're building new LNG facilities now, like we are doing in the US, like Canada is trying to do, like Australia is doing, it's going to be around in 2050. It might even be around in 2060. So the question is, it might make sense now to do coal to gas switching, but building new LNG infrastructure, does it make sense to be building them now when it's going to be around in 2050 and 2060 when we might need to achieve net zero emissions? And it's really important because if you look at this graph, what we're showing here is cumulative LNG capacity in million metric tons per year as a function of time. The yellow one is the ones that are already operating. So export terminals, which is what US has a lot of, we have about 325 million metric tons per annum. And we have a lot more coming online. The blue and the green basically tells you plans for the future. And by 2030, we're going to hit peak LNG export capacity at over 1,000 metric tons per annum. That's a lot of LNG. That's almost tripling our existing capacity. And same is the case with import terminals. And in many cases, a lot of these import terminals are in developing countries that do not have the capacity to build these facilities. So what we are seeing is a weird dynamic where exporters who are building export facilities in the US are also funding import projects in countries like Pakistan so that they'll have someone to buy their LNG. So there's sort of a toxic relationship between export and import. And there are serious questions around whether we might lock in some of the developing countries into buying US LNG for decades to come. And so what we did was we looked at all the proposed and under construction and approved LNG terminals that's coming online and compared the emissions impact of that to IPCC scenarios on temperature targets. So we looked at 3 different targets. We looked at 1.5 C, 2 C, and 3 degrees Celsius. And the reason we took these 3 different temperature targets is because if you look at some of these Paris compatible trajectories, all of them require a significant reduction in global fossil fuel emissions. So if you look at, for example, the 1.5 C pathway, CO2 emissions have to reduce between 90 to 100% by 2050 to be in line for 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. And if you look at different fossil fuels, gas emissions associated with natural gas has to reduce by 56%. So the question is, yes, you're reducing coal emissions, but how long is that valid? How long can you do the coal to gas switching before you're going to overshoot your emissions based on some of these temperature trajectories? So we took every single scenario that's been developed. Models are uncertain. So what we did was we just took everything that the IPCC did in their shared socioeconomic pathways to estimate remaining carbon budgets. So we took the median of these 3 temperature targets, 1.5 C, 2 C, and 3 C. 3 C is sort of close to what we might call business as usual based on existing trends, but it might go up or go down depending on how we make decisions in the near future. As you can see, 1.5 C is the most stringent. You almost have to get to net zero emissions by 2050. For 2 C, you have to reduce it by about 75%. And for 3 C, by 2050, you have to reduce only about 20% from the current 40 gigaton CO2 per year. And the 2 biggest uncertainties are infrastructure lifetime, how long the plants that are currently being built will last, and methane leakage from the source basins from which you get your gas. And what we're seeing is something that's very interesting in the sense that if you know you're going to be along the 1.5 C trajectory, then that means you're going to reduce your coal emissions. Your coal plants have to shut down within the next 10 to 15 years for us to still be on the 1.5 C trajectory. What that means is after 10 to 15 years, you're not going to have any coal plants lying around to be able to do the coal to gas switching. So what are you going to do with all the extra gas that's coming off from this LNG? And that's what we're seeing in our models as well. In the near term, it's fine to do 100% coal to gas substitution. And it reduces global carbon emissions across all temperature pathways. And this is largely because there's a lot of coal left, even in the United States, not to talk about China and India and Southeast Asia. What you're seeing in this graph is time on the x-axis between 2020 and 2050 and carbon emissions. The black line is emissions from natural gas and coal in the 1.5 C pathways in the IPCC scenarios. The blue line is emissions from natural gas and coal and LNG if there's no coal to gas substitution. So that's 0% substitution. The orange line with the uncertainty band is the emissions that you get from coal and gas combined when you have 100% coal to gas switching. And the green dotted line is sort of a reference where if you replace your coal with renewable energy or clean energy, zero emissions energy instead of natural gas, that will be your total emissions in that scenario. So a couple of interesting things. What you're seeing here is that the black line sort of crosses the orange line. So remember, orange line is where you have 100% coal to gas substitution. Black line is sort of baseline emissions trajectory you would need to be on the 1.5C global warming pathway. And around 2037, the black line crosses the orange line. What this means is that if you have the LNG that's coming online, and if you still do 100% coal to gas switching, around 2037, you're going to end up with more emissions than if you did not have this coal to gas switching. And the reason is because in the 1.5C world, coal-based power plants have to shut down quickly, that after about 2037, you're not having any coal plants in the world to substitute for. So you're just building new gas plants, and that sort of increases emissions. And this gets worse depending on what fraction of substitution do you do. This graph is about 100% substitution, but if your substitution is lower, obviously your emissions impact would be higher. And so to look at that in sort of a pictorial way is what you have is, again, time on the x-axis and the fraction of LNG for substitution from going from 0 to 100%. And the color coding between blue and red is net emissions. Blue means you're reducing overall emissions, and red means you are increasing emissions. So obviously you have to have a minimum threshold, which is about 61% to have net zero emissions benefit. So if you're only substituting, say, 40% of your LNG for coal to gas, your overall emissions is going to increase. And what you see on the right is sort of cumulative emissions. I'm going to take one example, the purple curve, 90% substitution. What that really means is 90% of the LNG that's coming online, you're using it for coal to gas substitution. So as you start substituting coal plants in 2020 with gas that's coming from the LNG, your cumulative net emissions reduces. You keep reducing cumulative emissions all the way until about 2037. But then what happens is you get an inflection point. Your net emissions that you're reducing starts deteriorating. So your cumulative net emissions starts going up after 2037. And that's because right around 2037 is where there is enough LNG to substitute every single coal plant that's still operating at that time. And so the more LNG that comes after 2037 will not have any coal plants lying around to substitute. So they'll have to start just burning those natural gas in new gas plants, which sort of diminishes your coal to gas switching benefit, because at that point, you're not switching anymore. And the situation is similar in the 2C pathways, but the timing of that sort of shifts to the right. And in the 3 degrees Celsius pathways, there's so much coal in the world all the way until 2050 that you're never in a situation where you'll run out of coal to substitute for. And so we start talking about regimes, LNG limited world versus coal limited world. So what we're finding is that the long-term LNG expansion is not compatible with 1.5C pathway, even under 100% coal to gas substitution. And this graph is sort of a great summary of what happens in these different temperature targets. What you're seeing on the y-axis is sort of the energy that's generated from coal-based power plants. So if you reach 0, that means you don't have any more coal left. And this is 2020 through 2050. So let's look at the 1.5C world. So we start with 35 exajoules of energy generated by coal plants all over the world. As you substitute coal to gas with LNG, your coal-based energy generation starts declining. It declines quickly, mainly because coal plants decline quickly in 1.5C pathways. And by 2030, you reach 0. So what happens is until 2030, you do get an emissions benefit from switching from coal to gas. You avoid some coal emissions. But at 2030, the net energy generated from coal is 0, which means you have substituted every available coal plant in 2030 with LNG that's coming online. And beyond 2030, you don't have extra coal to substitute. So you're just burning natural gas, the extra LNG in new gas plants. And therefore, this graph starts going negative. So what we see here is that in the 1.5C pathway, before 2030, we are sort of in an LNG limited world. There's more coal than there's LNG. And so there's not enough to substitute all the coal that's there. But after 2030, you're coal limited in the sense that there's so much gas that you can use for coal to gas substitution, but you don't have that much coal in the world to begin with for making that substitution. And if you look at the 2C world, the same thing happens. Until about 2038, we are limited by the availability of LNG. But after 2038, you're sort of limited by the availability of coal. Of course, in the 3C world, there's enough coal, so you never reach a point where there's enough LNG just based on current trends in proposed and under construction LNG plants. And the reason understanding this is important is because, as I started by saying, these plants are around for more than 30 years. Their average lifetime is 35 years, and the oldest one is nearly 50 years. And so building a new LNG terminal by saying, we will help reduce global emissions by coal to gas switching, what you're essentially saying is, I'm building it now in 2020, but I'll still be around in 2050. And if the world as a collective is serious about 1.5C or the 2C target, what we're really seeing here is that you're not going to be using that LNG for reducing global emissions all the way through 2050. And I think that's something governments and investors have to understand, because they're the ones investing in these new facilities around the world. And when I talk to investors, one of the things they say is that one way to think about LNG is sort of as an insurance against a 3°C world. So the reason I talk about it as insurance is because if we don't take strong climate action in the next few years, and we are on the path towards 3C, what we see here is that LNG is useful. Coal to gas switching actually reduces emissions in a 3C world. But if we do get serious and we get on the trajectory of 2C or 1.5C, then by necessity, you'll sort of have to strand some of these LNG terminals before their full operational lifetime. So an investor can invest in an LNG terminal as an insurance in 3C with the full understanding that it is highly likely that it might be stranded if we are on a 2C or a 1.5C trajectory. And the additional cost and the cost of these stranded assets is sort of as the price of this insurance against the 3C world. This is something that's of greater significance outside the US, because most of the LNG plants are privately owned and privately funded here. But if you look at import terminals in sub-Saharan Africa, in Asia, in Canada, the government is trying to buy into some of these and fund some of these LNG terminals. And that's something they have to seriously consider depending on the emissions trajectory of the world. And so this section of my talk was talking about, what are we doing about long-term issues with natural gas, and whether our current plans are really compatible with our rhetoric of net zero emissions, of adhering to the Paris Agreement of 2°C. In the case of LNG, we find that it's not, although in the near term it might be helpful, but thinking long-term about the lifetime of these infrastructure is a critical aspect that's been missing in policy discussions. With that, I'm come to the last part of my talk. This is what I'm interested in, because this is something that we are working on. We are thinking a lot about. So in the next 5 minutes, I'm going to give you about 4 questions, I think, on where the big, in my opinion, where the big research questions lie in terms of energy transitions. So the first thing I'm interested in and we are starting to work on is sort of the shift from fossil fuels to clean energy require effective long-term planning with a focus on equity and just transitions. When President Biden canceled the Keystone XL pipeline, there was this tension even before the election between unions who work on these pipelines, who work on fossil fuels. They're all unionized and they're good-paying jobs, and environmentalists who didn't want expanding our fossil fuel infrastructure. I think resolving that tension, making a plan for an effective transition is really important. And that's exactly what President Biden said in his remarks. And I'm quoting him here. They helped build this country. We're never going to forget the men and women who dug the coal and built the nation. We're going to do right by them, make sure they have opportunities to keep building the nation in their own communities and getting paid well for it. I think people understand this, understand the importance of these transitions. Anything that's planned is always better than anything that's forced onto you. But the question is, very few communities have figured out how to do this in the right way. And I'm going to give you one example of what we are doing here and how we are trying to understand this. The first question in this future work aspect is looking at how can states and communities dependent on fossil fuel revenues make a successful transition. So this is a Sankey diagram that one of my postdocs, Dr. Devyani Singh, created, and she's working on this, is looking at how states are using revenues from oil and gas. This is New Mexico, a reliably democratic state, so they want to tax fossil fuels to make sure they pay their fair share. And there are different ways they get taxed. You have property tax, state leases, federal leases, and severance tax. All these funding, about $1.5 billion in the case of New Mexico, which is about, I think, 12% of their state budget. And you can see where that money is going. A large fraction of fund from the oil and gas industry is going to public education, about $1.2 billion. That's 35% of all funding for public education in the state of New Mexico. That's insane. If Biden, and the problem with New Mexico is a lot of their oil and gas revenue are tied to BLM land, Bureau of Land Management, which means when President Biden says, let's ban leasing in oil and gas, New Mexico will be one of the states that will be affected. And what gets affected is another critical question. Public education is going to be affected. And so the question is, we know where we have to go in terms of net zero emissions. How can we help states? How can we help communities wean away from these oil and gas revenues so that the critical services like public education, public health, and public safety do not experience a sudden drop in funding just because we have to take action on climate change? And I think figuring this out is important. And it's going to take a different approach with different states, but looking at local conditions and local issues is sort of really important to understanding how this transition can be successful. A second thing, and this is something that I'm personally interested in, is satellite technology. Can satellite technology put an effective end to cross-border carbon leakage and penalize the worst oil and gas offenders? For example, we know a lot about methane leakage in the US. We know next to nothing about methane leakage in Russia. And yet the EU imports a lot of gas from Russia, and they don't really have a way of measuring it because Russia will not let them go in and measure emissions. But satellites could change that. It's quasi-continuous, it's remote. So regulatory agencies can independently verify inventory and operator reported emissions estimates. The real questions here are, can satellites isolate individual facilities? Perhaps. Some new companies are trying to do this. We don't know if it's going to work. And from a scientific perspective, how can we verify satellite data using ground-based measurements? There's a lot of experiments that we are planning to do this, but this has to be done on a global scale and sort of continuously. And so there's a lot of rich questions in this area to be explored in the next 5 to 10 years. The third question is, how can we use things like machine learning and models such as FEAST to help states achieve gas-related climate targets? So this is, we have all talked about methane emissions in the US, 2%, 1.6%, whatever the leakage value is. But what's really underlying that picture is, and you're seeing here on this slide, is that they vary by states a lot. For example, New Mexico and Arizona, they have one of the highest emission rates because of the Permian Basin that's there. While the Marcellus Basin in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia have some of the lowest leakage rates in the country. So what does this mean when cities start talking about natural gas bans, upstream through downstream? If Pennsylvania bans, if California bans natural gas, it gets a lot of its gas from the Permian Basin, so the Permian gas will go somewhere else. So are we increasing emissions somewhere else? What are the equity concerns around it? Who is going to pay for the retrofitting? What about people who cannot change to say a heat pump and will have to pay added costs for maintaining the gas infrastructure? So there are a lot of questions around, how can we enable this transition when the impact across states are very different. And the last question I'm working on, I'm going to stop after that to take questions, is, what is the future of coal in developing economies, and how much of a role can natural gas play in reducing emissions? This is a project that we call the Coal Transition Feasibility Index. You might know some of the technical challenges around the age of the coal plant, whether there's pipeline infrastructure, whether there's capacity factor, what type of coal they're using. But we also want to bring in economic and social factors into this. For example, in a place like India, where there's a lot of coal, people talk about how renewable energy is really cheap, and therefore they should stop using coal. The real challenge is not the energy that coal generates. The real challenge is the communities where coal is being mined. For example, in India, many of these mining communities, the coal companies actually build schools and roads and hospitals and local infrastructure because the state does not have the capacity to actually build those things. So if you're talking about a shutdown of coal, you also have to talk about how can state capacity be improved? How can the state provide basic services that now the coal company is providing in these communities? So thinking about the economic and the social factors into this transition question will help us better understand whether the coal to gas transition is really possible, and if not, what are our options for these communities in developing countries. So these are sort of the 4 questions that I am most interested in, that students in my group are working on. There are a couple of other interesting side projects that came out of these questions, but what I'll do now is I'm going to stop here and take some questions on this topic or anything else that you're interested in. But thank you for having me, and yeah, happy to answer your questions.
All right, thank you for a fascinating talk. There have been a couple questions into the Q&A, and we just determined that those who are signed in as panelists can't use that link, so feel free to drop them in the chat. I guess we'll just start in order. The first is from Martin Volker, and who's asking if you have any comments on a new study, the Gas Index, by Professor Gruber at Georgia Tech, about the underestimate of leak rates from city gas systems.
That's a great question. So Emily Gruber is a good friend. We both, I was at Stanford while she was also at Stanford. So the gas index is especially interesting because it sort of details the emissions issues in the distribution system. Am I surprised that it's 72% more than previously estimated by the EPA? Not at all. We are seeing that in the upstream side as well. But what I'm most interested on the distribution side is, what are the solutions to this? Some cities are going by the way of banning natural gas hookups, but that's, again, interesting and problematic, because if you're going to subsidize people to build in heat pumps instead of natural gas, who are you going to subsidize first? And the more thornier question is, if some people, if well-off people get off gas, then poor and marginalized communities will be left hanging to pay the costs of an ailing and old infrastructure. So questions around equity become really important when thinking about what is the solution for distribution systems in this energy transition.
Yeah, so
all right,
the equity is in the center of it. So another question from Jeff Rutherford, where does the flaring ban fit in? And the suggestion that zero flaring could backfire because venting would replace flaring.
Right, that's actually a great question. And in fact, this was one of the biggest reasons why a ban on routine flaring and venting has not been talked about until recently in the EU. And the reason the EU is all in on no routine flaring and banning is because they are putting, in my opinion, a lot of unwarranted faith on what satellite technologies can do. I think satellites hold great promise, but it has not been proven yet. They are very new. They need to be tested, experimented. But I think once we have these new technologies that can monitor remotely, sort of forcing a flaring ban or ban on routine venting should not be that difficult from a regulatory perspective. There's,
Right.
I think, a question in the chat.
Yeah, there's so a few more in the chat. I'm actually going to jump in because I have a question and I didn't write it down. But
Okay.
I'm curious about, so I mean, your comparison, I mean, the analysis of sort of stranded LNG is very interesting. And I'm wondering, particularly in the developing nation context, so you're kind of offsetting coal in that analysis, but what about other uses of LNG? I mean, for example, for household energy, for industrial uses, I mean, how does that figure into that analysis?
That's a great question, and that's actually something we are working on next. Right, this analysis was restricted to the power sector, but we're actively looking at what developing countries are going to do in some of the other sectors that use gas. This is also something that is very country specific. The conditions in India on domestic production versus LNG is very different from a place like South Korea or China because of different resource constraints. So thinking about that within the context of geopolitics is very interesting and complicated, and that's something we're starting to work on in terms of future energy sources. I want to address this question in the chat. So how should we, so the question, I'm going to repeat it for everyone.
Yeah.
Duke Energy has framed the near-term generation choice as either retire coal and build gas plants or retain coal for a little while. So the question is, how should we consider a near-term plan for US utilities to build natural gas power plants? This is actually a great question because one of my students is writing a paper on this. So far, the argument has been, gas is better than coal, so let's do the coal to gas switch. I think for the US, it's a little late to be building new gas plants, especially combined cycle gas plants, for the reason that you build it now, it's going to be around for 30 years, and we're not sure if we want it, especially if President Biden's goal of net or clean electricity, 100% clean electricity by 2035 is going to become reality. But I think the bigger issue is, if you look at where the gas is going to come from, then you see a clear difference between the different states. So if you want to do a coal to gas switching in Pennsylvania, I would say go ahead and do it, because we have very low methane leakage in Pennsylvania. The natural gas is nearby. And you can get the emissions benefit that you typically get from coal to gas switching. But if you're going to do it in the Midwest, in Minnesota, in Iowa, where gas often comes from the Bakken or from Canada, where leakage is much higher, the benefit, the emissions reductions from coal to gas switching is not going to be much at all. And so in that question, you really have to think about, is it really making sense to do a coal to gas switch when your emissions benefit is only maybe 10, 20%. So in that case, you want to think about, maybe it's just best to move towards renewables. California is actively thinking about that in terms of what their upstream leakage liabilities are, but that's something states have to start considering in terms of where they get their gas from and what does it mean for their own state goals on emissions.
So there's another question just above that one in the chat from Joe DeCarolus, if you'd like to, I'll let you.
Let me scroll up. Curious to know what role CCS coupled to natural gas might play in the future and how it affects the role that natural gas LNG can play in the 1.5 C and 2C scenarios. This is an interesting question. We haven't started working on it formally with respect to CCS, but I've had a few conversations with folks in India on prospects of CCS. And the reaction I get is I often get laughed out of the room in most cases when I bring up CCS. Mostly because coal, renewable energy is so much cheaper. There's been reports in southern India where you have most solar and wind, that solar plus storage would be cheaper than existing coal in 2021. And so when that's the scenario and you're talking about adding additional costs on top of a coal plant, that's not going to go anywhere in a place like India, because climate change concerns are important and the government cares about it, but they're much more interested in pollution mitigation. And CCS is not going to do a lot in terms of addressing pollution from these coal plants. You want to talk about scrubbers and other tools to reduce PM and SOx emissions. So CCS, I think, might be very useful in an industrial context, both in the developed world and the developing world, but I don't see CCS playing a big role in the power sector in developing economies, especially on coal plants.
Jeremiah also just asked another question. I think we have time for another quick one, and we may need to wrap up, but if you want to take a look at that.
All right, so if we have time or need, so sorry, I was just, as we decarbonize, how big of a risk is the challenge to maintain natural gas infrastructure under decreasing utilization? Is there a threshold utilization under which natural gas infrastructure is no longer maintained? Yes, but it also depends on which region we're talking about. For example, in Philadelphia, the gas distribution is maintained by Philadelphia Gas Works, which is sort of partly owned by the city. The city can tolerate a much longer term in terms of maintaining their infrastructure than a for-profit utility that might have to shut it down. One of the things that I'm working on with the city of Philadelphia is understanding this gas. Philadelphia, and I think many Northeast states, have so many old buildings that in many cases it's not possible to replace them. And so the question is, what are the different buildings that can be replaced with heat pumps in this county, in this city? And what does that leave us with in terms of maintaining gas infrastructure? This is a question states are grappling with, but the answer to your question on is there a threshold, that's going to depend by state and by city that's planning this. But irrespective of what the threshold is, even starting a sort of a retrofit program, questions around who gets retrofitted and who gets the subsidies is very important, even before we even get to the point of this threshold issue.
I actually have one more question I'm going to sneak in. So you mentioned the vehicle electrification as sort of a demand side piece. Do you have a sense for whether that will have implications for natural gas demand in electrical generation in the sort of decade time frame, or I don't know, have people looked into that?
Some folks at Nettle are looking into that. I've had some conversations with them, but I'm not directly worked in that. I've heard discussions about natural gas probably becoming a good fuel source for long-haul trucking systems, but I don't know how far advanced such types of discussions are. There's been a push in developing countries to expand CNG infrastructure, compressed natural gas for transportation, largely because of to reduce pollution from diesel. But again, that is going to be a very small part of the demand side changes we're going to see in natural gas.
Well, no, I actually meant increased demand on the electric generation that increases demand for CNG power generation.
On the power generation side, that's a good question. I think the short answer is I don't know, mostly because I don't do this energy system modeling, but I'm sure there are studies. Jeremiah and Joe might know a lot more about this, looking at the impact on the power sector of widespread electrification of transportation. But yeah, it's a question a lot of people are trying to answer right now.
All right, well, I should stop using my moderator imperative and let Martina take us home. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and thank you, Dr. Gershop, for moderating. But that's all the time that we have for this webinar. I'd like to thank again Dr. Ravikumar for presenting this fascinating talk, as well as thanking you all, both NC State and non-NC State students, for joining us in our first event of the semester. Again, if you'd like to learn more about our organization and upcoming events that we have this semester, please visit our website again at ncsuenergy.org. And we're also on Instagram at Student Energy Club. So that's all I have. Have a great week.
All right. Thank you so much for having me.